What if Syray's latest documentation makes two seemingly counterintuitive things true at the same time? The first is that the probable cause affidavit presents a false narrative that could be exculpatory to Bryan Kohberger. And the second would be that the facts remaining after removing every allegation of misconduct may still be prejudicial to him. At first glance, those two ideas seem to cancel each other out. They don't. And that's what we're going to unpack. This isn't a video about proving Mr. Kohberger innocent, and it isn't about defending the prosecution. It's about understanding how both of those propositions could be true, and why that distinction matters. That's the principle at heart of this video, one that's often lost in discussions of high-profile criminal cases. A probable cause affidavit is a narrative. It's a story assembled from evidence to establish probable cause. Like any narrative, its strength depends on whether the underlying facts actually support the conclusions being drawn, and whether those conclusions survive scrutiny when challenged by the opposing party. That's where Syray's latest documentation becomes so important. If his analysis is correct, then one of the central narratives presented in the probable cause affidavit may not be supported by the underlying data. If that's true, then the affidavit doesn't simply become weaker, it becomes affirmatively exculpatory because it presents a sequence of events that the data itself cannot sustain. But that doesn't end the analysis. Once you set aside the challenge narrative, you're left with a difficult question. What facts remain? Not what was alleged, not what was inferred, not what investigators believe happened. What facts remain once every challenged assumption and every allegation of misconduct is removed from the analysis? That's the question we're going to explore. Because it's entirely possible that the answer leads to two conclusions at the same time. That the state's narrative, as presented in the probable cause affidavit, cannot be relied upon, while some of the remaining facts may still be viewed as prejudicial to Mr. Kohberger. And understanding the difference between a flawed narrative and the facts that survive that scrutiny is essential to understanding where this case may actually stand. So let's begin with what I believe Syray's latest documentation actually establishes. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to accept his analysis wherever it challenges the narrative presented in the probable cause affidavit. If he's correct, then portions of the state's timeline and movement narrative simply aren't supported by the underlying CSLI data. That's a significant conclusion because a probable cause affidavit derives its credibility from the facts and inferences it presents. When those inferences aren't supported by the underlying data, the narrative itself becomes vulnerable to challenge. And if the defense can demonstrate that the state relied on a narrative the data itself cannot sustain, the challenge isn't merely procedural. It can become affirmatively exculpatory because it undermines confidence in the state's reconstruction of the events leading up to the crimes. But I don't think the analysis ends there. Because even after accepting Syray's criticisms for purposes of this discussion, there are still facts that appear to survive that analysis. And those surviving facts deserve just as much attention as the portions of the narrative that may not. In my view, the first is the most significant. One fact appears to survive entirely untouched by Syray's analysis. His documentation does not appear to dispute that Mr. Kohberger's phone reconnected to the network at approximately 4:48 a.m. while south of Moscow, Idaho. That matters because the defense's public alibi placed Mr. Kohberger west of Pullman, Washington, near Huawei Park. Whether you accept FBI agent Balance's interpretation or Syray's criticism of it, this particular fact appears to remain unchanged. That's significant because this isn't a point of disagreement between the competing analyses. It's one of the points where they appear to converge. In my opinion, it creates a problem for the defense's public alibi because a phone reconnecting south of Moscow, Idaho is difficult to reconcile with the assertion that Mr. Kohberger remained west of Pullman, Washington, near Huawei Park.
Now, if Syray says that Kohberger's phone was on the network from the Paradise Ridge Tower and there was a handoff to the Whitman Road Tower, then I would absolutely have to sit back in my chair and go, oh, that's not good, because that would put Kohberger right here and he would have to be in this area before the handoff to this tower happened.
That doesn't answer every question, but it does mean that this is one fact that still requires an explanation, even after accepting Syray's criticisms of the PCA narrative. That leads directly to the second question. If Syray is right, then his interpretation still has to explain how the phone got there. If you adopt Syray's interpretation, you inherit the obligation to explain every surviving fact. That's exactly the same standard you're applying to agent balance. So the phone reconnects 9.8 miles south of Moscow, Idaho. From there, the later AT&T tower sequence from south of Genesee, Idaho, is consistent with westward travel. Looking at the map, I don't immediately see how those two facts fit together. Does this mean that the vehicle had already traveled through Moscow, Idaho before the phone reconnected? Or is there another explanation that fits both the cellular data and the map? If there's another explanation, I'd genuinely like to see it. This brings us to the third area I found particularly interesting. According to the scope of his engagement, Syray wasn't retained simply to critique Agent Balance's interpretation of the CSLI data.
Syray may testify for the defense as an expert regarding cell towers, drive test geolocation, mobile device forensic extractions, call detail records, and software that is used to interpret this data.
He was retained to perform geolocation analysis. That matters because I think as a mobile forensic investigator, it establishes the standard that his own report should be judged against. Applying the same analytical standard to Syray's report that he applies to Agent Balance's, I expected to see an expert opinion addressing every meaningful source of available geolocation data. Instead, I was left with two unanswered questions. Syray notes that a map application appears to have been running on Mr. Kohberger's phone, but he offers no expert opinion on whether it contained location information that either confirmed or contradicted the competing interpretations of the CSLI data. Likewise, I found no discussion of whether commercially available geolocation data, such as fog reveal or similar sources, was actually examined as part of that geolocation analysis. Syray raises it, but doesn't disclose whether or not that was used. An expert opinion isn't just judged by what it says, it's also judged by what it leaves unexplained. I'm not suggesting that another source would have favored the prosecution or the defense. I'm suggesting that if geolocation was part of Syray's scope of opinion, I expected the report to tell me whether those sources were examined and what significance, if any, they had. By leaving those questions unanswered, the report leaves significant portions of its geolocation analysis open to challenge. The guilty plea means we'll never know how Syray would have answered those questions under cross-examination. But the fact that they were never tested through the normal adversarial courtroom process doesn't make them any less important. When I started this video, I suggested that Syray's latest documentation may make two seemingly contradictory things true at the same time. I don't think those ideas are contradictory anymore. I think Syray raises serious questions about whether the narrative presented in the probable cause affidavit is supported by the underlying data. If those questions are valid, they deserve to be taken seriously because a criminal conviction should never rest on a narrative the evidence can't support. At the same time, I also think his report leaves facts that still require explanation and questions that his own analysis never fully answers. Those two conclusions can coexist. And that's why I don't believe this case is best understood through the words guilty or innocent. The more appropriate question is whether the state could still prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt after the challenged portions of its narratives are stripped away. To me, it's the difference between innocent and not guilty. One is a factual conclusion, the other is a legal conclusion reached when the evidence no longer satisfies the burden the Constitution requires. In my opinion, understanding that distinction is the most important lesson to come from Syray's report. The justice system doesn't promise perfect investigation. It doesn't even promise perfect evidence. What it promises is that before the government can take away a person's liberty, it has to prove its case with reliable evidence that survives scrutiny. Because of the guilty plea, many of these competing interpretations were never tested through the adversarial process. That doesn't tell us which interpretation would ultimately have prevailed. It simply means some important questions definitely remain unanswered. Whether you're convinced Mr. Kohberger is guilty or convinced he's innocent, I think that's a principle worth protecting. Because once we stop insisting on it, the precedent doesn't stop with this case. It belongs to every case that follows. If you like my videos and how I present the information, please subscribe and like the video.